Welcome to True Crime Cases. Today, we are unveiling a shocking story of jealousy and violence. Azalea and Stephen appeared to be the perfect couple. They had been married for 9 years, living in a grand old Victorian house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Stephen, a successful architect, was known for his meticulous designs and tireless work ethic. His passion for his career had earned him a reputation as one of the best in his field. Azalea, on the other hand, was a lively, charismatic woman who enjoyed socializing and maintaining a vibrant social life. She was the kind of woman who lit up every room she entered, her infectious energy captivating everyone around her. But behind the closed doors of their beautiful home, things were far from perfect. Stephen's career had consumed him, leaving Azalea feeling increasingly neglected and lonely. Their once passionate relationship had cooled over the years, and Azalea found herself yearning for excitement and attention. She missed the days when Stephen would surprise her with romantic gestures or spontaneous trips. Now their conversations revolved around Stephen's work, the renovation of their home, and the mundane details of daily life. When Stephen decided to hire 2 builders to handle the extensive renovations needed for their old Victorian house, Azalea saw it as an opportunity for something new. The 2 builders, Andre and Ian, were everything. Stephen wasn't rugged, muscular, and exuding a raw masculine energy that Azalea found irresistible. Andre, with his deep blue eyes and charming smile, and Ian, with his strong, silent demeanor, were a stark contrast to Stephen's polished, refined nature. As the days passed, Azalea couldn't help but be drawn to the 2 men. Their physical presence and easygoing attitudes awakened a long, dormant desire within her. What began as harmless flirtation quickly grew into something much more dangerous. It wasn't long before Azalea's flirtations with Andre and Ian became more brazen. She began spending more time at home during the renovations, offering the men drinks and snacks and engaging them in increasingly suggestive conversations. She reveled in the attention they gave her, the way they looked at her with open admiration, something she hadn't felt for Stephen in years. One particularly hot afternoon, Azalea invited Andre and Ian inside for a cold drink. Stephen was away on a business trip, and the house was quiet, except for the sounds of the builders' tools. The atmosphere was charged with unspoken tension as the 3 of them sat in the kitchen, the conversation flowing easily from work to more personal topics. Andre was the first to make a move as Azalea refilled his glass. He gently brushed his hand against hers, his touch lingering longer than necessary. She looked up to find him gazing at her with a mischievous smile, and her heart skipped a beat. Ian, sitting across the table, noticed the exchange but said nothing. A knowing look passing between him and Andre, emboldened by the heat of the moment, Azalea leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a seductive whisper. "You boys have been working so hard. Maybe you deserve little reward." The implication in her words was clear, and she could see the effect it had on both men. Andre and Ian exchanged a glance, and without a word, they followed Azalea up the stairs to the master bedroom. The house, which had been filled with the noise of construction just moments ago, now seemed eerily silent in the privacy of the bedroom. All 3 of them crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. What started as a single impulse of act quickly became regular occurrence. Azalea was intoxicated by the thrill of the forbidden, the danger of getting caught, and the passion that had been missing from her life for so long. She threw caution to the wind, believing that Stephen would never find out about her secret tryst. But Azalea's carelessness would soon come back to haunt her. Stephen returned from his business trip with a sense of unease that he couldn't quite shake. He had always been a man of intuition, able to read people in situations with reasonable accuracy, a skill that served him well in his career. But now that same intuition was telling him that something was wrong at home. Azalea seemed different, more distant, more distracted. She would often leave the room to take calls, speaking in hushed tones, and she seemed to be spending more time at home than usual. At first, Stephen tried to brush off his suspicions. He knew the renovation was stressful for Azalea, and he blamed her change in behavior on that. But the more he observed, the harder it became to ignore the signs. Small details began to stand out: the way Azalea would glance at her phone and smile, the sudden disappearances when the builders were around, the slight tension in her voice when Stephen mentioned their names one evening while they were having dinner. Stephen noticed that Azalea seemed particularly preoccupied. Her eyes kept darting to her phone, which she had placed face down on the table, a habit she had recently developed. When she excused herself to take a call, Stephen couldn't resist the urge to check her phone. He knew it was a breach of trust, but his curiosity got the better of him. As soon as Azalea was out of earshot, Stephen flipped the phone over and quickly scrolled through her recent messages. Heart pounded as he found several texts between Azalea and an unknown number, messages that were far too intimate to be from a friend. His stomach churned as he read them, the words confirming his worst fears. Azalea was having an affair. The realization hit Stephen like a punch to the gut. His hands trembled as he put the phone back in its place, his mind racing with a mix of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. But instead of confronting Azalea immediately, he decided to wait. He needed more information, more evidence, before he acted. Over the next few days, Stephen kept a close eye on Azalea, gathering more proof of her infidelity. He noticed how she would send quick texts whenever she thought he wasn't looking, how her face would light up whenever she saw new message. He even caught her sneaking out of the house once, only to return an hour later, her hair disheveled and a guilty look in her eyes. Stephen's suspicions were no longer just suspicions, they were confirmed facts, and as he pieced together the truth, his heartbreak began to morph into something much darker, a cold, calculating desire for revenge. Stephen's patience was rewarded sooner than he had expected. One afternoon, he returned home earlier than usual, his mind still buzzing with the thoughts of Azalea's betrayal. As he walked up the driveway, he noticed that the house was unusually quiet. The sounds of construction that had filled the air for weeks were absent, and the front door was slightly ajar. Stephen's heart began to race as he quietly entered the house, every instinct telling him that something was wrong. He made his way through the hallway, the silence of the house amplifying his growing sense of dread. As he approached the stairs, he heard it muffled voices coming from the master bedroom, followed by a low, breathless laugh that he recognized all too well. Without thinking, Stephen climbed the stairs, his footsteps silent on the carpeted steps. As he reached the top, the voices became clearer, and with each word, his fury grew. He pushed open the door to the bedroom, and there, in the bed had shared for years, was Azalea with Andre and a yawn. The scene before him was like something out of a nightmare. Azalea, caught in the throes of passion with it. Two builders didn't notice Stephen at first, but when she did, her face went pale with shock. Andre and a yawn scrambled to cover themselves, their faces a mixture of surprise and fear. Stephen stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes locked on Azalea's. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The air was thick with tension, the only sound the heavy breathing of the three people in the room. Stephen's mind raced, 1,000 thoughts crashing into each other, but all he could feel was a deep burning rage. Azalea was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "Stephen, I can explain," she stammered, but Stephen cut her off with a Cold hard look. Don't, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Don't say another word. Without another glance at his wife or her lovers, Stephen turned and walked out of the room. As he descended the stairs, mind was already formulating a plan. He had always been a man of precision and control, and now he would use those qualities to exact his revenge. Stephen's anger simmered just below the surface. Old and calculating, he spent the following days in a state of eerie calm, going through the motions of daily life. As if nothing had happened, he continued to be polite and attentive to Azalea, never once hinting at the storm brewing inside him. To Azalea, it seemed as if Stephen had forgiven her, or perhaps had not fully grasped the extent of her betrayal. But Stephen was far from forgiving. Instead, he was planning his revenge with meticulous detail. He began by reaching out to a private investigator, a man he had worked with before on cases involving construction fraud. Investigator was discreet and thorough. Exactly what Stephen needed. He hired him dig deeper into Azalea's affair to find out every detail about her secret tryst with Andre and a yawn. Within days, the investigator delivered a file filled with evidence, photos, text messages, even video recordings. Stephen pored over the documents late into the night, each piece of evidence fueling his resolve. He learned that the affair had been going on for months, and that Azalea had even considered leaving him for one of builders. The betrayal cut deep, but it also solidified his determination to make her pay. Stephen's plan was simple but effective. He began by cutting off Azalea's access to their joint bank accounts, leaving her with only a small personal account she used for household expenses. He wanted to create a sense of insecurity to make her realize just how dependent she was on him. Next, he arranged for a series of accidents to occur at the house, small things that would gradually escalate in severity. The first incident was a simple slip on the newly polished floor, causing Azalea to sprain her ankle. Stephen feigned concern, but inwardly he felt a grim satisfaction. The second accident was more serious. Azalea's car brakes mysteriously failed as she was driving home from the grocery store, causing her to swerve off the road and crash into a ditch. She emerged, shaken but unscathed, and Stephen was there to comfort her, his expression carefully neutral. But Azalea was beginning to suspect that something was wrong. She couldn't shake the feeling that Stephen was behind strange incidents, but she had no proof. The thought of confronting him terrified her, so she remained silent, hoping that the accidents were just a string of bad luck. As the days turned into weeks, Azalea's life began to unravel. The once confident, vibrant woman was now a shadow of her former self, constantly looking over her shoulder, jumping at every unexpected sound. Stephen's calculated cruelty was taking its toll, and she found herself retreating further into isolation. The affair with Andre and a yawn had lost its thrill, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread that she couldn't shake. Andre and a yawn, sensing the change in Azalea, began to distance themselves from her. They had no interest in getting caught up in whatever was going on between her and Stephen. They continued with their work, but their interactions with Azalea became more professional. The flirtation that had once defined their relationship, now a distant memory. Stephen watched all of this with a cold detachment. He had achieved exactly what he wanted. Azalea was broken, isolated, and completely under his control. But the satisfaction he had expected to feel never came. Instead, he was consumed by a growing sense of emptiness, a hollow void where his love for Azalea had once been. One evening, as Stephen sat alone in his study, he found himself going through the file the investigator had given him. Once more, he stared at the photos of Azalea with Andre and a yawn, their faces blurred by the motion of their secret rendezvous. A part of him had hoped that he would find some solace in revenge, that it would somehow make up for the betrayal. But all it had done was deepen his misery. It was then that Stephen realized that his plan had one final step, one that would bring everything to a close once and for all. The day of reckoning came sooner than Azalea expected. It was a rainy Thursday evening, the sky a deep shade of gray reflecting the bleak she felt inside. Stephen had been unusually quiet that day, his mood unreadable. She had spent most of the afternoon in the bedroom trying to avoid him, the weight of her guilt and fear pressing down on her like a physical burden. When Stephen called her downstairs for dinner, his voice was calm, almost soothing. Azalea hesitated for a moment before obeying, a sense of being settling in the pit of her stomach. As she entered the dining room, she noticed that the table was set with her finest china, candles flickering softly in the dim light. It was a stark contrast to the tension that hung in the air. Stephen greeted her with a smile, his eyes betraying nothing. "I thought we could have a nice dinner tonight," he said, pulling out a chair for her. Azalea nodded mutely, her heart pounding in her chest. As she sat down, the meal was a quiet one, with Stephen making small talk about work in the renovations, while Azalea answered in monosyllables, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen, that this was the calm before the storm. As they finished their meal, Stephen stood up and walked over to the cabinet. Pulling out a bottle of wine, he poured them each a glass, handing one to Azalea, before raising his own in a toast to us. He said, his voice steady, "To 10 years of marriage." Azalea forced a smile, clinking her glass against his, but the wine turned sour in her mouth. She could barely swallow, her throat constricting. As she watched Stephen take a sip from his glass, he set the glass down and looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Azalea," he began, his voice soft, "I know about the affair." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Azalea's heart stopped, her mind going blank as she tried to process what he had just said. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Stephen continued, his tone calm and measured. "I've known for a while now. I've seen the texts, the photos. I even know about the meetings in our bedroom." Tears welled up in Azalea's eyes as she realized the full extent of what he knew. "Stephen, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean for it to happen." But Stephen cut her off with a wave of his hand. "It doesn't matter now," he said, his voice growing colder. "What's done is done. But there's one more thing I need to tell you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial, placing it on the table between them. "Do you know what this is?" Azalea stared at the vial, her breath catching in her throat. What is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Stephen smiled, a cruel twist of his lips. "It's a poison, tasteless, odorless, and very effective. It's already in your wine." Azalea's eyes widened in horror as she looked down at her glass, the reality of his words hitting her like a freight train. No, Stephen, please." But Stephen just stood there, watching her with a cold detachment. "You brought this on yourself, Azalea. You made your choices, and now you have to face the consequences." As the poison began to take effect, Azalea felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. Her vision blurred, and the room seemed to spin around her. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out beneath her, sending her crashing to the floor. Stephen watched with a detached calm as Azalea struggled to breathe, her body convulsing as the poison did its work. He felt no pity, no remorse, only a deep, hollow emptiness. This was the culmination of everything, the final act in the tragedy that their marriage had become. Azalea's struggles grew weaker, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she clawed at the floor, trying to reach for something, anything that could save her. But there was nothing. The poison was too strong too quick. Within minutes, her body went still, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Stephen stood over her, his face expressionless. The woman he had once loved, the woman who had betrayed him, was gone. But instead of the satisfaction he had expected to feel, there was only a profound sense of loss. He knew he couldn't stay there. He had to leave, to disappear before anyone discovered what he had done. But as he turned to walk away, he was met with an unexpected sight. Andre and Ayan standing in the doorway, their faces hollow with shock on it. Andre and Ayan had returned to the house to collect their tools, unaware of the horrors unfolding inside. They had seen Stephen's car in the driveway and assumed he had left the door unlocked, but as they entered the house, they were met with a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Azealia lay motionless on the floor, her once vibrant eyes now dull and lifeless, and standing over her with a look of cold indifference was Stephen. For a moment, the three men just stared at each other, the weight of the situation sinking in. Stephen was the first to speak, his voice low and threatening. "You weren't supposed to see this." Andre and Ayan exchanged a glance, their instincts screaming at them to run, but their feet felt rooted to the spot. They had never seen Stephen like this before, so calm, so controlled, and yet so dangerous. "What did you do?" Ayan finally managed to ask, his voice shaking. Stephen's gaze flicked to Azalea's lifeless body, then back to the two men. "What I had to do. She betrayed me, and now it's over." Andre took a step forward, his fist clenched at his sides. "You killed her. You murdered your own wife." Stephen's eyes narrowed, his calm facade slipping just a fraction. "You don't understand. Shy was cheating on me with both of you." The accusation hung in the air, and Andre felt his stomach drop. He knew they had crossed a line with Azealia, but he had never expected it to come to this. "We didn't mean for it to go this far," Andre said, his voice filled with regret. "We never wanted her to get hurt." Stephen laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Hurt? You think this is about her getting hurt? This is about betrayal, about trust being shattered. And now you'd have a choice." Ayan frowned. "What choice?" Stephen's expression hardened. "You can either walk away from this, forget everything you've seen, and never come back, or you can try to stop me, and I'll make sure you end up just like her." Andre and Ayan looked at each other, weighing their options. They knew they were in deep, and that any wrong move could cost them their lives. But they also knew they couldn't just walk away from what they had seen. Azealia might have been unfaithful, but she didn't deserve to die like this. Ayan was the first to move. With a sudden burst of speed, he lunged at Stephen, aiming to disarm him, but Stephen was ready. He sidestepped the attack and brought his fist down on Ayan's back, sending him crashing to the floor. Andre sprang into action, grabbing a nearby chair and swinging it at Stephen. The blow caught him on the shoulder, knocking him off balance. Stephen stumbled, but quickly recovered, his eyes blazing with fury. The fight was brutal, the three men grappling and striking at each other with everything they had. Furniture was overturned, glass shattered, and the sound of their struggle echoed through the house. Despite their combined strength, Andre and Ayan were no match for Stephen's cold determination. He fought with a ruthless precision, using every object within reach as a weapon. Andre was the first to fall, a sharp blow to the head, rendering him unconscious. Ayan, bleeding and battered, knew he couldn't keep this up much longer, but he refused to give up. He charged at Stephen again, this time managing to land a solid punch to his jaw. Stephen staggered back momentarily, dazed. Seeing his chance, Ayan grabbed a heavy candlestick and brought it down on Stephen's head with all his strength. Stephen crumpled to the floor, blood pooling around his head. Ayan stood over him, breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced at Andre, who was still unconscious then at Azalea's lifeless body. The house was a scene of carnage, and Ayan knew they had to get out of there. Ayan's mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do next. He couldn't stay in the house. He had to leave to get as far away as possible before anyone discovered what had happened. But he couldn't just abandon Andre, and he couldn't leave Azalea's body there for the authorities to find. He dragged Andre's unconscious form to the car, laying him in the back seat. Before returning to the house, he looked at Azalea one last time, a wave of guilt washing over him. He had never intended for any of this to happen, but now he was in too deep. With shaking hands, Ayan cleaned up the scene as best he could, wiping down surfaces and removing any traces of their presence. He knew it wouldn't be enough to fool a thorough investigation, but it was all he could do. In the short time he had he returned to the car and drove away, his heart pounding in his chest as he sped down the dark, empty streets. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched